Blood Meridian is a 1985 novel by the American author Cormac McCarthy. McCarthy was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1933, and he died 89 years later in Santa Fe. He wrote 12 novels, beginning in 1965 with The Orchard Keeper, and including his Pulitzer Prize-winning The Road in 2006, but Blood Meridian is usually considered to be his masterpiece. This review contains spoilers. It's set in 1849 in the southern USA and northern Mexico, and it follows an unnamed young man called the Kid, whose mother dies in childbirth, whose father won't speak to him, and who runs away from home at the age of 14. He joins a group of mercenary soldiers, but the long expedition on which they embark is a thoroughgoing disaster and ends with most of the company being slaughtered by Comanche warriors. The Kid survives. After a series of minor misadventures, he's arrested, but he's released when his fellow convict, a man called Toadvine, the Kid's acquaintance since almost the beginning, persuades the authorities that he and the Kid could hunt down and kill Indians. They'll be paid by the scalp, the severed top of a person's skull. The pair team up with an established gang of scalp hunters led by a man called John Glanton, a real historical figure, an opportunistic sadist, who was killed in 1850 at the age of 31. Literally speaking, Blood Meridian is unusual. As Philip Mayer points out in his 2015 introduction, McCarthy is the only living writer whose prose style stacks up against the great modernists, and yet he has no interest in internality. We rarely get a sense of what his characters are thinking. He's working in an older, perhaps the oldest, narrative register. There's a strong hint of the King James Bible in here, but of course all of the oldest stories in history have an overridingly objective focus. Blood Meridian could be summed up as a long series of journeys across the American frontier, relieved by laconic dialogue and punctuated by graphic atrocities. The long journeying allows McCarthy to bring his considerable powers of description to bear. The atrocities arguably showcase the novel's conception of human nature. In order to get at that conception, it's as well to start with one of the three epigraphs at the beginning of the book. It tells of a 300,000-year-old human skull discovered in 1981 that showed evidence of having been scalped. The implication, more obvious in the context of the novel as a whole, seems to be that gruesome violence predates recorded history and may be the hallmark of the human race as a whole. The novel's events illustrate this, but it's also articulated by its most interesting character, a huge, hairless man called Judge Holden, another real historical figure, an Anglo-Texan and Glanton's second-in-command. The fact that Holden's impressively cerebral, as he apparently was in reality, may be meant to show that human cruelty isn't a product of ignorance. It bypasses such trivialities as culture and intellect. The Blood Meridian version of Judge Holden often makes his worldview explicit. In chapter 17, he says, "War endures. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. Beyond that, he believes that men were made for games of chance, particularly those in which life itself is at stake. He's a technician of kinds, endeavouring to discover new phenomena, but his conception of science is characteristically bellicose. Whatever in creation exists without my knowledge, he says, exists without my consent." Judge Holden clearly represents something or someone, but it's difficult to say what or who, which is precisely what makes him so disturbing. When he expounds his philosophy, it's always from a different angle. We encounter it in shards, and we never see enough to grasp its central point. What we do know is that there's a black hole at its centre, a place we'd probably rather not go. McCarthy's description of his dance at the end of the final chapter skillfully evokes an all-pervading existential desolation. This is a very male novel. The only time a woman even speaks is to express indignation in the cause of human kindness, but she plays no meaningful part in the story. On the plus side, although it's probably one of the most violent novels ever written, there's no explicit sexual aggression. Rapes are briefly implied, but never described. Of course, that raises questions in itself. Does this novel speak about humanity, or is it really only concerned with half of it? When Judge Holden expounds his philosophy, he tends to do so in terms of man. We'll usually read that as a synonym for humanity, but perhaps that's wrong. Maybe it really does only refer to men, to males. Perhaps the female of the species tells a different story. McCarthy doesn't give us much of a clue. As a result, he's innocent of the charge of being a man writing about men, but claiming to speak on behalf of women. Or is he? You decide. This is a hugely important novel and possibly the greatest of the second half of the 20th century. The writing's so good and the theme so challenging that it demands successive rereadings. Its bleakness makes that difficult. Nevertheless, I think it's a novel everyone should read at least once.